Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the AfghanEye podcast. I'm your host Sangar, and in this episode we have a guest, author of the book Onvoorspelbaar Verleden. It's a Dutch book written by Nikko Norte, who is a former Dutch soldier in Afghanistan. Welcome to the AfghanEye podcast.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. Well, I have received your book and I have read your book. I was impressed, and first of all I would like to ask you, can you explain why you have titled your book Onvoorspelbaar Verleden?
Onvoorspelbaar Verleden translates into unpredictable past, and I've chosen that title because over the 10 years that we have left Afghanistan as the Dutch army, the story quite changed. I mean, whatever I hear right now, today, the stories I hear are quite different from my experiences in Afghanistan when I was there. Hence, unpredictable past. Because clearly the past is something you cannot predict. It changes with time, and that's mainly what the title suggests.
Okay, so would you say that you have written this book in order to make sure that a version of the past remains as recorded the way you have experienced it?
I think that's a very good summary. I think it's rather important that the past stays as it was, because the moment we change it, especially when it comes to things like war and military interventions, as soon as we start changing or allow the past to be changed, horrible things can happen. The past should remain as it was, and it should be told as it was. Problem is that the past is not always a pretty thing, and it is very interesting to change it, and we should not do that. We should look at the past as it was. And what bothered me is that over a period of 10 years, no single soldier stood up and said, okay, I will tell the story as it was. There are many stories about heroism, about terrible actions of the Taliban that had to be addressed, and that is not the reality. And I think I have a certain right to talk about the reality, because I stayed 2 years in Afghanistan. I've seen quite some actions of the Dutch army. All the stories that we hear about or read about are short stories about certain actions that do not properly address the whole episode of time that we were there. So if you take one action that have taken place and you say, okay, that must have been horrible, or there must have been a lot of fighting, I think you should put that in a broader perspective. And that's what I tried to do. And I've tried to just relay the past as it was, and that resulted in the book that I wrote.
Okay, we will discuss your book later, but first of all, I want to get to know you as a person. So I've read that before you went to Afghanistan, you already had a very extensive career in the armed forces, correct?
Not really. I had a rather short career in the Dutch military. And after that, I worked on my own account. I was often hired by people that wished to investigate a certain territory, for example, in Turkey or in the Balkan. I've often been sent out to those territories just to reckon them and make my reports and give an impression of a situation in a certain area.
From a security perspective?
Often from a security perspective, it's you can evaluate a certain area by just reading about it or by talking to people that have been to that area. But another approach is to send people there and to make them live among the people and see what they have to report. That has basically been my work for quite some years. But I did not work specifically for the army. I had contractors from all over the world, people that had business interests or whichever interests in countries in Africa, in the Balkan, in the Middle East. And I just went there, mingled with the people like I was a regular tourist, and wrote my reports about what I saw.
You have mentioned that in your book as human intelligence. Mm-hmm. So we could say that human intelligence as human is your specialism?
HUMINT, so human intelligence,
Yes.
that is my specialism.
Okay. And you were also deployed to Afghanistan under that particular capacity?
Not really. It is a capacity that I took upon myself. I was put in a certain position. I had a certain job to do, but that job I could have been doing in, say, 2 minutes a day. So there was a lot of time to be filled. That is something I discovered before the mission in Uruzgan. When I was practicing with the regular troops to get ready for the deployment to Uruzgan, I was, well, let's put it simple, bored. And I asked permission to leave for Afghanistan, for Uruzgan, before the mission started. So I traveled to Uruzgan a few months before the Dutch mission there started. And quite automatically, I started doing what I was used to be doing. And I walked out into Uruzgan and mingled with the people. I went on trips with the Afghan army, the Afghan National Army. I met an American platoon that was still very active in the area. So I tried to travel outside the gates of our compound as much as possible and gathered a lot of experience, gathered a lot of intelligence, and that is something I later tried to communicate with my colleagues when they arrived in Uruzgan.
Okay. When I started reading your book, one of the first aspects of your book that really impressed me is that you made a distinction between waging war and making war. And you also said making war on false grounds. I think you know which segment I am referring to. Could you explain what you mean with making war and waging war and doing that on false grounds?
Well, war for some reason is an inevitable thing in human life. It's regrettable, but we wage war against each other, and sometimes there is a reason for it. I mean, there's multiple examples to be found in history where we had to fight a war. In Uruzgan, there was nothing to fight against. There was no enemy. There was no reason to make any kind of war or to even engage in violence. That was my opinion. That's the way I saw Uruzgan, as a very peaceful province. In that province happened a lot of things that we were not used to. But man, that's a matter of getting used to. But it was not a reason to start a war. And if you look back at that period of time and you look at the amount of bombs that we threw and we look at the amount of ammunition that we shot, and then there is only one conclusion. That's that there was a war going on. And the next conclusion is that we must have made that war because there was no reason whatsoever to shoot at anything. So we created a war, and I think that's a pretty bad thing to do. There was no reason whatsoever there were no grounds for war in Uruzgan. We were not under any kind of attack. There was no enemy. There was no enemy. There was nothing to fight against. And still we fought, which made us make a war, which was not necessary.
And on false grounds, how would you characterize that?
Well, if you gather your intel with all the means that you have as a modern society with only one purpose, to pinpoint an enemy, then that is wrong. I think you should leave the option open that there is no enemy. And if you use all your intelligence assets only to prove that there is an enemy that has to be brought to its knees, then that's totally wrong. You first have to see whether that enemy is really there, and to be shot at doesn't mean that there is an enemy. That means that you are being shot at. That is completely different from being in a huge fight. Whatever happened there was seen as enemy action from some enemy that we could not even identify. and we fought that enemy with all means that we had at our disposal, and that was completely wrong, in my opinion.
Would you say that your mere presence was creating enemies?
Absolutely. If we hadn't been there, nothing would have happened. I mean, no one in Uruzgan depended on our help or assistance. I mean, people were quite able to fend for themselves. And there was no reason to fire a single shot. But we looked for that reason and found it.